It's been about a week since the Bloodlines 2 extended gameplay trailer, and I'm feeling a little bit hollow about it because I wanted one of the extremes. I either wanted it to be so hilariously bad that it was at least comedic, we could at least laugh about it, or, I guess the coper in me, I was hoping it would be really good, it would exceed expectations, and I'd be wrong. They were actually doing a fantastic job, and I just couldn't see it. Unfortunately, it wasn't at really either end of the spectrum. It kind of sat, I would say, about 75% towards the bad end of the spectrum. It wasn't a total disaster. There were maybe some slightly redeeming factors, but most of it was pretty bad. We can be critical of it. And the good parts I mentioned, it's really just the combat looking serviceable, probably more fun than people were expecting. And for me, I'd spent a bit of time criticizing Avowed, the Obsidian game, where the fun factor for me wasn't really there in terms of the combat we've seen for that game. For Bloodlines 2, it at least looks sort of kind of fun when you get into combat. The issue there for me is that was not what I was looking for out of a Bloodlines 2. If this was a random vampire game that had solid enough combat, then sure, maybe it's worth checking out, but not for Bloodlines. This is the sequel to a beloved game whose strengths were never combat. It was, I would say, bad in some places in Bloodlines 1. It's the reason the last sort of third of the game isn't really well remembered. It becomes a combat romp. And if I was putting together sort of a dream list of the game I was desperate for, my dream game in terms of Bloodlines 2, if I was putting that list together, at the very top, I would probably have, say, the characters, having memorable ones. It would be the writing. I want to have interesting dialogue. I want to have great choices to make within those dialogue options for myself as well, and the character I'm playing. I'd want the clan choices to be varied in a way where, depending on what I pick, it's going to greatly change the gameplay experience. So if I'm a Nosferatu, it might be very different to the other options at my disposal. Certainly exploration. I loved the hub worlds back then. Any of those games where you've got hubs and you can explore them, everywhere you go, every sort of nook and cranny is memorable. I absolutely love that. We're talking games like, say, Deus Ex Human Revolution, for a kind of recent one. I mean, it was, 15 years ago or something now? But you know what I mean. The games where you can kind of do missions that take you out of the hub world, and you had that in Bloodlines 1 as well, where you had, for instance, the hotel, many other missions that are varied in setting, and often sometimes in gameplay. They might have a horror vibe, other ones are more like a level in maybe Thief, or something like that. There's so many others as well. I mean, the music, just the general atmosphere, all that stuff, it's incredible in the original Bloodlines. The problem with Bloodlines 2 is none of what I mentioned seems to have been done well. They focused on the combat, which on that dream list I would have had pretty low. It doesn't mean I don't care about combat. If they could improve on what Bloodlines 1 was doing, if we could get a better combat system in the sequel, that's fantastic. But if it is at the expense of all I mentioned, the characters, the writing, the story, everything else, if you're doing combat as the priority, that feels like a mistake where you're going to basically please no one. The original fans, who you seem to be marketing this to, you're calling it the second Bloodlines game, which means you're sort of banking on that nostalgia. You want the old fans to come back. That is what has made this, I suppose, a little bit less niche than like a Swan Song or the other Masquerade games that people just don't really care about so much. I'm sure they don't sell nearly as well or as wishlisted as much as Bloodlines 2. It's one of the most highly wishlisted games on Steam, and that is because of the cult classic status of the original. Many people, they might not have played it in 2004 when it came out, but over the years, people have gone to it. They've been recommended it. The old meme of every time it is mentioned, someone reinstalls it and probably recommends it to a friend. That's been going on for years. So they've been marketing this to the old fans, but they provided absolutely nothing of note for them. So we're just kind of in an odd place where I don't think this will be an unmitigated disaster as a game overall, but I don't think it's going to please the fans. They've been extremely critical, and any new people who sort of join this universe, they play this game, they're not that familiar with the original. What are they really going to get? Something that's maybe competent in terms of combat, but then it has boring dialogue, lame characters, terrible terrible voice acting. That's certainly one of the many criticisms I could mention. And they're probably going to think, what was all the fuss about? I'm not going to play the original Bloodlines. What the hell is this? So the Chinese room, they're in a tough place. If they want to kind of redeem this, get the fans back on board, they've got to stop showing off the combat as kind of the main event. It's fine. I think most people will accept if this is the combat. Great. We don't need to really see too much more of this. We're sold on the combat. The issue is everything else looks bad. It looks mediocre at best. You've got to turn that around if the game's going to get anywhere, because otherwise this is going to be a big flop. There might be some upfront sales because of the name, but then I think it's just going to be totally forgettable. Something did kind of pique my interest though, because what I wanted to show you today is there's been a new development diary. Now, a lot of these have been out. This is the 8th one. Some of them have been terrible. They've just talked about technical stuff, and they've been so long-winded, it felt like they were just written or put into ChatGPT. There was no passion behind them. But the last couple have been by the game's director, Alex Skidmore. He seems okay. He's probably been dealt a bad hand in terms of having to make this RPG extremely quickly. And I say RPG because that's part of the concern. It feels like the role-playing elements are kind of missing from this so far. So hopefully that changes. But Alex Skidmore, he doesn't have the worst history in gaming. He hasn't really made any great role-playing games or anything, but he's worked on like Gears Tactics. Probably not a game I'd play, but at least it's a tactical game with tactical combat. It's not just something totally generic. But he wants to talk about today, after speaking about feeling like a vampire. That was one of the diaries he's put out, the other one being about immersive combat. He now wants to talk about exploring the world of darkness. And this at least gets us on the right track in terms of how we're going to explore the world in this game. Because another concern about the gameplay reveal is that it was all set in one location. I've always had a big concern that this studio had basically nothing. They had those 5-10 second clips, and that was really it. Maybe some combat animations. They proved me wrong to some degree because they at least had extended gameplay. The combat sections they were working, it looked fine, but then we come back to, do you only have that one location? What else have you been working on? I'll give them some benefit of the doubt now. I don't think it's going to be a total scam. Like, I kind of did when they switched developers, and it seemed like Paradox were absolutely rushing this. That's when I was at my most pessimistic. I'm still pretty negative towards the game, but I think something will release. It'll be playable from start to finish. However, is it going to feel like it should? Is it going to have those hub worlds? Or is it going to be missions-based? I know they've talked about exploration and side quests, but it's easy to talk about. They're not really committing to anything specific. It's like, well, you can explore a linear level. We never said it was going to be open like the old game. They can kind of get away with saying anything to you that sounds good. But is it going to have the hub worlds, or are we going to have linear missions? Because in that gameplay reveal, it was like the same section over and over. And they can say that's for a story reason, but all I'm thinking is this a limitation? Have you not created any other locations? You've talked and talked about all we're going to do, but when you actually show it, it's just this one tiny level, this tiny bit of content. Went for 15 minutes, but we never went anywhere else except for this old warehouse. So he does speak here about exploring the world of darkness, covering the setting, society, characters, RPG elements of the game. It's always nice to hear. It's just a shame we haven't seen it. But he does say we'll be talking in depth about RPG elements at a later date. I find that odd because it's what most people are kind of looking forward to. Why are you so excited to show the combat, but you're putting off this RPG stuff? That seems a little bit strange. We do have this new screenshot, I assume. I haven't seen it before, at least. How about one of the hub worlds, some playable footage? That's what people are really wanting to see at this stage. Now, I'm going to try and read out the good stuff here. There's a lot of text, so I'm going to try and simplify it and just find what's actually interesting. He does mention our goal with this pillar, in terms of exploring the world of darkness, was to create a version of Seattle that is authentic to the World of Darkness IP, and makes you believe that this hidden side of Seattle, where vampires are in control, could be real, and that in contrast, the human world feels more alien to you and potentially unreal. Now, they go on and on about making this like Seattle, and maybe not replicating Seattle, but at least having points of interest and being true to the city. I'm going to be honest, if you couldn't tell by my accent, I don't live in America. I've never been to Seattle. I'll probably never go there, and so I don't really care about how true to the city you are. I just want an interesting setting. I want a nice location or multiple locations to explore if they go the hub world route, and there's a few of them. That's all I really want to see. If you get the landmarks right and all of that, but it's boring, you're going to lose me. I'm sure you're going to lose a lot of other people as well. I imagine there's a lot of Europeans who like this. They often enjoy CRPGs. Not that this is one, but I think most people just care about the fun factor. Make sure it's interesting to explore. We've got to have good quests, side quests. We've got to have a reason to kind of explore the city, and just keep the scale realistic. Don't try and overdo it. So many developers do that, where they try and have these huge open worlds. They're trying to market it as, oh, it's way bigger, many more square meters than the previous game, and the whole thing just feels unbelievably dull. So just make a nice scale. It doesn't have to be bigger than Bloodlines 1. It just has to be a reasonable environment that kind of immerses you in, and that's all that's needed. It doesn't need to be true to Seattle. Focus on the right things. Make this fun. Make us want to play. That's what's kind of missing right now. He goes into what it'll be like to play as Phyre and mentions in Bloodlines 1, or at least you're finally mentioning something about the original. I was worried that no one at the studio had actually played it. But in Bloodlines 1, you're a new vampire in a city with a large anarch presence where the Camarilla don't have complete dominance. For Bloodlines 2, we flip this on its head. You play Phyre, an elder vampire, 400 years old, in a city where Camarilla has been dominant for decades, and any hint of anarch sympathy is squashed. Phyre's number one loyalty is to herself, but she is wise enough to respect the power of the Camarilla, and more importantly, the Masquerade. Now, it does mention that in this game, within the story, Phyre earns a seat at the top table of the Camarilla as the court's sheriff. Now, that's not new info. That has been mentioned before, I think in the extended gameplay trailer. I'm sure really well-versed Vampire the Masquerade fans could kind of tell us what this means and if we should be concerned about that. Again, just sort of seeing Phyre, I'm never really convinced just looking at the character that she's all this and all that. And I know you can apparently play as a guy as well, there's concept art, but I'd be very concerned that they don't cancel that towards the end and they make up some excuse that, oh, it all just worked. The female Phyre, it made more sense. We didn't want to do any extra work, so we'll see. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll be the male Phyre. But I guess what's important is how this plays out, because he mentions that this is an RPG. Of course, well, not of course, because we haven't seen a lot of it. You've showed us all the combat, the RPG stuff's been pushed to the side, it looks like. So show us more of that, convince us. But he mentions that you can roleplay sheriff in multiple ways. Maybe you're a loyal sheriff of the Camarilla, or an anarch sympathizer working from within to undermine the court. Or maybe you're a self-centered elder vampire, playing the different factions off each other to your advantage. It all sounds fantastic. It all sounds great. How's this actually going to work, though? Because we've seen the dialogue wheel. What was there? At most 4 options. I think whenever they've shown it to us, there's maybe been 3. So is this how we're going to do all this role-playing that you're talking about? We're going to make sort of one choice every now and again in dialogue, and that's going to be it? Or is there more to it that you haven't shown? Is there sort of more to this puzzle? I don't know, because if the game is actually coming out this year, I'm not convinced that they're going to have time to fulfill everything that they've spoken about. I mean, outside the combat, there just doesn't seem to be a lot there, and I'm not really convinced that they can deliver on these sorts of promises unless the game gets delayed. If it isn't, this sort of stuff's going to be really watered down. I think the RPG side of things, it's not looking super promising. They've talked about showing us later on, but when they showed the interface, I was going to say inventory, but there doesn't even seem to be an inventory in the game, just like going into the menu where you can see a codex and little things like that. It seems like there's not a lot on the RPG side. There's like a skill tree, but that seems to be it. You won't have like weapons and things like that. That doesn't appear to be in the game. So when they say they're going to show us the RPG stuff, I really don't know what that's going to be. Is it really just going to be showing that skill tree? Is it going to be a handful of choices? Is it really just the main quest? Do we make meaningful choices in side quests as well? I hope something happens with that dialogue wheel, because that excites no one. It was in Fallout 4. Everyone clowned on it. Even Bethesda got rid of it for their follow-up game in Starfield. And as bad as that is, at least it doesn't have the dialogue wheel. It's got a positive over Bloodlines 2. So work to be done. Towards the end here, we've got an important part of the Masquerade is that vampires are hidden in plain sight in our society. There are several vampire hangouts in the city, which to a passerby appear innocent, but to those in the know are important places in vampire society. For example, the little old lady who runs the all-night coffee shop may not be as sweet and defenseless as she seems at first glance. I feel like this is going to be an example of something that could be mysterious and interesting, and the game will just make it super obvious. Like, you go in there, and then Fabian, the character in your head who keeps talking to you, will be like, oh, this old lady, I don't think she's quite what she seems. Oh, we better investigate. Just an example of a lot of games these days treating the player like they're a moron, or the developer being scared you're going to miss out on the content, that sort of stuff. So it sounds nice on paper, but let's see it practically. They do mention, though, that a key location the player often returns to is Weaver Tower, a Seattle corporate HQ that is actually the front for the Camarilla. Inspired by the downtown skyscrapers in Seattle and given the city's prints a skyline view over their domain. So is that going to be like a hub within a hub? You return back there? My only concern about that is it sort of comes back to that mission structure where you're not going to just be able to sort of walk around the city at will. That maybe Weaver Tower is kind of the hub world. It's just a couple of rooms that you can walk around in, speak to key characters, and then you sort of teleport from there to the various missions, and they're going to be the key sites in Seattle, because they mention in here that they're not going to have the whole Seattle city, which makes sense. I don't expect them to. That would be stupid. But they do talk about specific landmarks that you'll be able to go to. And is that just going to be mission locations? Or is there going to be an element of exploration in the city? I think there's no excuse, because even RoboCop Rogue City, which is a great game if you're looking for sort of a AA game, not sort of absolutely mainstream, huge budget, but a solid title, that is it. If this game was as good as RoboCop Rogue City, I'd be totally happy. Not as good as Bloodlines. I mean, that's a classic, but that would be acceptable to me. I don't think this will be as good as that. However, that kind of has the hub world structure. So if that game can do it, I really think these guys should be able to, at least in theory. So it seems like for now, they're just going to give us these snippets every now and then. It doesn't seem like another big reveal of information is going to be on the horizon. They have said at least that they're going to show the RPG elements possibly soon. They say a later date. That could be any time. I just hope they don't leave this too late, because the longer time goes on, the less anyone is going to be convinced that there are actual RPG elements in there, aside from maybe that skill tree, in terms of actually making choices in the world, approaching situations really differently. I'm not just talking about either going for stealth or going in sort of guns blazing, or we should sort of say fist blazing. That's not going to cut it in a sequel to Bloodlines. It's going to be much more than that. Now, you might be asking yourself, who cares? This is obviously going to be a disaster. I agree. My issue is, if it's bad in such a way that executives think, hey, this is a relatively well-made game for its budget, why did no one buy it? It must be that no one likes vampire games. I do not want that to be the conclusion. If it's bad, I want it to be really obvious why. They didn't listen to fans. They made a bad game if we're talking about it in the context of the Bloodlines series. That's my issue, because even if this sucks, which it almost certainly will, at least for my expectations, I hope one day we can get some sort of successor. Whether it's a real Bloodlines or it's just a spiritual successor, I hope we get it, because the setting's really interesting for an RPG. It just doesn't seem like this developer really know what they're doing in that sense. Maybe the game itself, maybe it'll be a 6 or 7 out of 10, competent combat, everything else a bit of a dud, but that's not what I want. You're using the Bloodlines name, you've got to get it right. We'll see what goes on with the RPG elements. Maybe we'll at least get back to the comedy side of it, where it's so bad it's funny, but at the moment it's just kind of sitting somewhere in between. But thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers, bye.